Welcome to the Boring Climate Podcast, a platform that encourages serious climate conversations. Today, we travel to the far east of the country, to a region that is as biodiverse as it is disaster struck, the Sundarbans, often called a climate change ground zero. In geographical terms, the Sundarbans is a vast coastal delta with mangrove forests formed by the rivers Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna on the Bay of Bengal. It straddles both India and Bangladesh and is home to some 4.5 million people. But its location puts it at the mercy of the sea and the rivers. Over the past century, the Sundarbans has steadily lost land to the rising Bay of Bengal, and in the past decade alone has been struck by half a dozen devastating cyclones. All this is to say that no current climate conversation is complete without attempting to understand the Sundarbans and the challenges its people and biodiversity face. Joining us today to help us understand this region is Dr. Annu Jalais, environmental anthropologist and associate professor at Krea University. Anu has lived with and studied the communities of the Sundarbans for decades, and her work illuminates how climate change, conservation, and human non human relations intersect in the Sundarbans. Welcome to the show, Anu. So glad you were able to join us.
Thank you so much, Vishwada, for having me. It's a pleasure
So,
to
to
be here.
start off with, and give our listeners some context, why did you decide to study the Sundarbans?
For many reasons, actually. I had been there as a child. We had lived for a month in an island called Bashanti with my mother. She was learning Bengali, and somebody had suggested that she go there. Um, Also, I had returned as a class 8 student in the late 80s on some nature study camp. And I was fascinated by what I had been told about the place. It's kind of the far west, right, of any child growing up in Kolkata. So also, what had happened, there was a very, very deadly cyclone in 88. And my father and one of his friends, Shobhanlal Banerjee, both of them decided to, he was an architect, Shobhanlal Banerjee, both of them decided to build a cyclone shelter.
Okay.
So in a way, it was kind of the first cyclone shelter that was built in the region. So I was quite interested by it. I had heard a lot of stories, and I wanted to know more. It was always a region that sort of, attracted me. Yeah.
Right. And your work sits at the intersection of environmental anthropology, climate change, as well as the human animal interface. Could you tell us a little bit about what your approach to studying the region is and how you've developed your methodology over the years?
So what happened? Two things happened. When I went to the Sundarban and I told people I was interested in writing about them, they kept telling me, "But you need to know about our tiger." And I kept telling them that I wasn't interested in tigers so much because I was a student in anthropology and I wanted to focus on people. And they kept saying, "How will you write about us if you know nothing about the tiger, about the forest?" Something else happened, very practical. It had been barely a week since I was in the Sundarban, and there was this newly constructed hut with a thatched roof. And I entered my hut and I see a huge snake on the bed. So I come out, I ask one of the young men there, to come with a stick because that's the first thing, right? A snake, you take a stick. And I told him to enter my room. And he said, "Oh, it's just a daral. It's okay." And he goes out. So I said, "Am I supposed to live with it?" He said, "Yes, you're very lucky. Usually in new huts, any kind of snake can come. You got a rat snake. If I kill this one, you may get a cobra." So just as well that this is the snake that has decided to come into your hut. And you learn very quickly that everything is about coexistence. Everything is about compromise with, a fauna that may not always be very friendly, but this is life. So these are the ways in which I I learned to sort of open my eyes and try and see things from their point of view as opposed to mine. Something else had happened so I was doing my PhD at the London School of Economics, and Philippe Descola, a French philosopher and anthropologist, had just written Spears of Twilight on his observations in the Amazon. And he had spoken about how the jaguar there was seen as some kind of brother, a kindred soul. And communities there believed that they could become the jaguar and the jaguar could be human. And listening to the stories about tigers in the Sundarban, I realized that people had the same kind of understanding of that creature, that it was, they kept talking about how it was cantankerous but compassionate, how it sort of knew how to listen to people, all kinds of magical charms could have an effect on them, just as tigers could appear in dream and talk to people. So it was a very, very symbiotic relationship. And this is the start of this trying to understand the non-human world, and what it means. And I say non-human and not animal because for me, non-human is more egalitarian, whereas the idea of the animal is that it's always inferior to the human. So this is why I prefer using non-human. But yeah, so that's how my methodology started. That's how my intellectual understanding of, how to understand beasts, how to understand creatures that I always, and that I had always relegated to, the zoo or the periphery of my existence. And now you had these wild creatures I had to learn to coexist with. So
Right.
yeah, that's how it
So,
started.
those of us who haven't been there, and I'm guessing that's a lot of people in our country, could you give us an idea of the landscape of the Sundarbans and how stable or not the region is today in the context of our changing climate?
So the region is the largest mangrove forest delta in the world.
Right.
It always was inhabited by people living in boats. Fishermen coming from different parts of Bengal, staying here for a few weeks, leaving. You also have mention about the pirates that lived there, the Arakan pirates, the Portuguese pirates. You have Bernier from the 17th century telling us that he's passing through these forests and these forests are very strange and are very different from what he knows. He also had been told that he might be killed by a tiger because he was nice and fat. So this region is a region that perhaps shouldn't have been inhabited in the way it was under the British, where the British decided to convert a lot of these forests into revenue generating land. And for that, they converted some of the northern islands of the Sundarban into basin like structures. Because if you want to take over an island of the Sundarban, you need to build a huge, big mud wall about 2 to 3 meters high that will prevent the high tide from entering the island. That's how you start getting a soil that is not going to be saline because the rainwater will wash the salt off from this saline soil. So you cannot, as an individual or as a family, take over new land. A lot of people say, encroachment. No, no. Once these islands are formed and you've built that mud wall, you live there, but you can't go and take over. You can go and cut wood, but you can't go and actually, you know, settle in a new part of the Sundarban because that would mean infrastructure. Yeah, like you would really need a lot of people to come together and build these mud walls around the island. So these islands are, as it were, floating, right? Surrounded by rivers. Now, these rivers are often changing course. So, if you look at NASA images of 20 years back, you see how some places have shifted. You see that some islands have become bigger, some smaller, some, seem to have moved. So, this geography is very unstable. It's, this active delta region. So the British soon abandoned this idea of creating revenue generating lands because it wasn't, generating so much revenue. But for that, they had brought people from all over. And so these people 200, 300 years ago came and started living in these islands. Now, I don't think that the blame should be on these people. And I think that the bigger problem has been global warming as well as the building of dams, the Faraka Dam, and all the dams that have been built around the Bengal Delta, affecting, Bangladesh. We never hear about these dams in the media. Bangladesh is surrounded by 200 dams built on the Indian side. And this is what has caused a lot of trouble. So even in West Bengal, the Faraka Dam has created siltation, and therefore the rivers are not as fast moving. So you have sandbanks coming up. It's a geography you have to imagine, a geography that moves. Now, communities in the Sundarban have always been mobile. And I feel their default, if you look through the history, you will see that it is mobility. Bengalis have always traveled, have always, you know, gone here, there, everywhere. And so a lot of these people anyway lived on boats. When you work in the forest, you spend half your life in the forest on a boat. So mobility is the default way of being. And today, I live in Chennai, and I find so many people from the Sundarban region working as construction laborers, working as cashiers, as servers in restaurants. So you come across a lot of Bengalis, and they've come from the Sundarban region because there's not enough land. That land is not fertile enough. They want better options for their kids. So if you have a lot of paddy growing land in the Sundarban, you don't move, and you probably live in a safer place. However, if you live on the outskirts of islands, you are probably a fisherman and you have nothing to lose. So you try, if you are 20 today, you try and work in a garments factory somewhere in Tirupur. So this is how, yeah. The, you were asking about the. I hope I gave an idea of the geography as well as where people have been moving and why.
Yeah, which in fact brings me to another question I wanted to ask you. So, a lot of your studies focus on the fact that there are about 4 or 5 major interconnected climate and environmental challenges that are faced by the Sundarbans. And this is causing a lot of movement of people. And in fact, the migration has, in some media outlets and some articles, been termed as among the first climate refugees of the world. Can you tell us what these interconnected challenges are? Whether it's sea levels rising or land loss or mangroves deteriorating. What are these challenges and how is it affecting the region?
See, the greatest challenge, and this is what people themselves will tell you, they will use climate change in policy documents, and in Bangladesh, mainly NGOs use those terms to get foreign aid. In India, we are less concerned with foreign aid, so people don't talk about global warming or climate change. If you're in the Sundarban talking with people today, that's not what they talk about. They talk about the fact that there are not enough hospitals. Uh, Teachers are not coming in to teach from Kolkata. Previously, teachers would live next to the schools of the Sundarban. Today, the fact that there are better roads make it possible for a lot of teachers to come and go every day. And so they get tired and they don't always come. And the community there feels a little left out, because they used to like being able to talk to teachers, maybe have them draft letters and all of that. So this is what they're going to talk about. They're going to talk about corruption, unemployment, not not having enough infrastructure for them to have a better life. So this is the crux of the problem, and that is compounded by climate change. But let's not forget that, that is the real issue. We can't blame everything on climate change, right?
Yeah.
So, so yeah, you have land loss, you have deteriorating mangroves, you have salinity increasing, and this is something that is not new. It has already been there. But today, the cyclones are getting a lot stronger and a lot more dangerous. And so, as we know, climate change is human impacted, right? But which humans? Definitely not the humans living in the Sundarban. So, while tropical cyclones are natural phenomena, the rapid warming of the Indian Ocean, which is a direct result of greenhouse gas emissions, has fueled this intense, the storms getting increasingly intense in the region. And because the Indian Ocean, one needs to know, is one of the oceans that is warming up the fastest, perhaps the one that is warming up the fastest. And very often, uh, the temperature of the water exceeds 30 degrees. It's between 30 and 32. So this releases a lot of heat, and this forms storm, which intensify because you have depressions, and then you have super cyclonic storms that occur especially during the arrival of the monsoon in the month of May, so sometimes April, and when the monsoon retreats in October, November, sometimes December. So uh, one of the things that we have seen happening is that these cyclones intensify very, very quickly, a lot of the time just before landfall, and it makes it very hard for governments to organize evacuations, and therefore they become more dangerous. So, while the intensity of the cyclone is driven by global warming, the devastation is compounded by human activities such as, destruction of mangroves, unsustainable urbanization, that's poorly planned coastal towns all across India in the direct path of severe storms. Data over the last 20 years shows that there has been a significant increase in the severity of cyclonic storms in the Bay of Bengal, and it's not going to stop anytime soon.
Right. The cyclones, of course, have been covered quite frequently, at least in the last 5, 6 years. The region has been hit by several major cyclones. And some of the other climate impacts or climate driven impacts are probably sea level rise and the delta land itself sinking. To kind of put it in perspective, would you be able to tell us what is the rate at which sea levels are rising in the Sundarbans compared to the global average? And is it worse here?
So it is, I think, double the global average. It is about a centimeter, 1.2 centimeters per year. And in some parts of the Sundarban, it is 3 centimeters per year. Okay. So, and you have to understand that, as I was telling you, the river changes its course and suddenly entire chunks of land just disappear. So, but yeah, on an average, it's 1.2, when I think the global average is half of that. So the land itself is sinking, and as I was telling you, the dams and the siltation caused by the dams really has been a recipe for disaster in this region. And the destruction of mangroves for a whole lot of reasons is completely suicidal for everyone. Yeah.
Right. So this kind of like brings me to another question, which so the land loss has been estimated by some studies in the Sundarbans to be about 200 square kilometers of land since 1964. Can you help us put that in perspective?
So I wouldn't be able to tell you how many football fields that is, but all I know is that from the number of people I know in the Sundarban, you have quite a few of them who will tell me, my house used to be there, and they'll show me the middle of the river. So I know that over the last, 20 years, um, rivers have changed courses and land has just disappeared. So I can tell you what it feels like because one of my friends who lives there, she has on she lives on a strip of island now. It's so dangerous that there's only the house that is left. And from both sides of the islands, the river has been eating their land. So they lost all their land. All that remains is this little tiny house in the middle, and it's too dangerous to live there. So, what compensation will they ever get, for the loss of all of these paddy fields on either sides of the river? They won't get anything, right? And so, this is how it happens. And when new land forms, usually the government and local communities try to plant mangrove saplings so that that land can be kept, held and added to the island. And so that often becomes a playing field for kids and all of that. So, yeah, the perspective of suddenly losing everything from one day to the next or a gradual erosion is always there. And, you know, we can think of earthquakes, we can think of tsunamis, we can think of all of this, but here it happens at a greater level. It happens very often.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've also written about a quieter disaster, which is salinity, and you touched upon this earlier in the conversation. Can you explain how saltwater entering the soil affects the region and probably, forces migration even before the island actually sinks?
So the increased salinity has also coincided with tiger prawn cultivation.
Okay.
So there are two ways to look at the issue. One is that it has empowered a lot of people because it has given them, you know, a lot of these people who lived along the peripheries of islands, very often the poorest people, have converted their ponds that have been too saline into uh, shrimp fisheries, saltwater shrimp fisheries. Now, the problem with doing that is that the land inside gets contaminated by salt. And so the paddy fields of the big zamindar who lives, a bigha beyond or two bighas beyond your house gets contaminated. And you have a lot of infighting around that because on the one hand you have breaches caused by the river shifting course or crabs, and you have salt water entering. But one never knows. Sometimes this is done deliberately so that a whole region is flooded and becomes therefore shrimp cultivating, expanses. And that is detrimental then to the paddy growers. From Bangladesh, you have a lot of literature on how exploitative shrimp farming is. On the Indian side, from those I know, women spoke a lot about this empowering them because they used to fish tiny seedlings, tiger prawn seedlings, which they would then sell to these fishery owners and they would get their own money. Something they couldn't do with going to the forest because you can't go alone to the forest, you go with a team. Whereas here, you just take a net and you know, you walk along inside the river. But this has caused a lot of medical issues for women. Walking for kilometers and for hours inside this river salt water, trying to get tiger prawns. So it is, and as I was saying, Faraka has increased the salinity. These dams have increased, the salinity, especially on our side, which is why we have practically no Sundari trees left. Bangladesh has a few because the water there is freshwater, more freshwater than the Indian part. Also, if you look at the map, the Indian islands are a lot more south, the Indian inhabited islands, and the ones in Bangladesh are, at least 50 kilometers north. So the issues are not the same, because if in India you are surrounded by salt water, in Bangladesh the rivers that surround you are still fresh, and so a lot of people have been saying that we should break these embankments and have flooding because it's fresh water and it will regenerate the soil. Whereas if you do that in West Bengal, everything will just die. So every time you have cyclones or you have breaches and salt water comes in, if you're there 3 days later, it's just everything is putrefying. The smell is horrible. You have dead fish from the ponds because the ponds are freshwater, so everything has been contaminated. The plants are all dead. It's quite a desolate image, and that is because the river is so salty. So each part of the Sundarban is quite different. One needs to remember that. And so a lot of things that can be applied in Bangladesh can't be in West Bengal. It's because of the geography.
Right. Right. I mean, and what you kind of explained so far shows us this is a region with interconnected disasters, and it has created a kind of cycle of loss of lives or livelihoods or property. But because the problems are so unique to the region, what have you learned about how the islanders approach these challenges and what their approach is towards conservation?
So, when I started off with this story about them telling me that I needed to know their tiger before being able to write about them, I think that is for me one of the biggest lessons I ever got in conservation. If you cannot think of the non human, of the creatures that surround you as being part of you, as being part of your, existence, your biome in a way, you cannot really be a conservationist or somebody who cares about nature. You have to learn how to, coexist. And this kind of philosophy of coexistence went beyond just learning how to live with wild animals. It was also learning how to live with each other, people of different faiths, people of different castes, people of different socioeconomic levels. And so, even if you fight, and people there fight a lot, they told me that it had to do with the air being harsher, the water being harsher. Saline water makes you more cantankerous. They said if I stayed there, I'd become like that. I already am. So, so the thing that I noticed, despite the fights, every time there was a calamity, people would come together and forget their differences. So somebody's house got burned, somebody's lost their job, somebody's father has been killed by a tiger, somebody's baby has died. Whatever the circumstance, people came together. So, the one thing I learned was the resilience of these people and the humane, compassionate way in which they lived with each other. Um, and this for me has been something that I learned a lot from, and has informed my work. This outlook on what it means to coexist. But sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah, to an extent. The question was about how the local communities are dealing with the challenges that are so unique to the region that, maybe even policy hasn't kind of caught up with. So, yeah, what steps they take and how they deal with this. Yeah.
So yeah, so the fact that they help each other out, okay, number one, very very important. When you have a mud house and there's a super cyclone coming, you are so grateful for your neighbors who live in a brick house to tell you, come and spend 3 days with us, because that's usually how long it'll last. So that was number one. Number two is you have all these community organizations now that are planting saplings, mangrove saplings, that have organized themselves into doing that. But From the policy level, there's a lot more happening now than there was 25 years ago, but I feel it's still not enough. And there people have. So I'm going to do a house to house survey, but from the little I've gleaned over the last couple of years is that people are not staying there. Every time they can, they just leave. And so, there hasn't been a drastic rise of population in that place. So that has been quite surprising for me because usually, you in a village you see more and more houses, right? Here they've just changed. They've become brick houses, a lot of them, and from money that they got working in Chennai and Bangalore and elsewhere. But there hasn't been really a real interest in trying to change how people live. And that is because the NGO workers and the people in politics all live in Kolkata or its outskirts. Okay. And this is something very, very important. If you can afford, you leave. So I repeatedly come across people who want to work for the Sundarban and all of that, and they'll say, "Yeah, my father was brought up there. Yeah, but I now live in Kolkata." And for me, it has to be grassroots led. I think the government should also make it a law that only local teachers should be recruited to teach in schools, so that you don't have the problem of people coming from Calcutta and coming 2 days a week because they feel tired to come the other days. So I think there should be, at the policy level, there are a whole lot of ways in which things could be changed and made a lot more equitable. But for that, you would need to know what is happening on the ground. Things are changing.
Right. You mentioned that if people could afford to, they leave, which kind of brings about two questions. One is, what is the impact on the people who are leaving? And two, the people who are left behind are probably the ones that need the most help. But because that number is dwindling, are they and the issues that the Sundarbans face, is that getting ignored to a large extent?
So, from what I have noticed, it's usually the older people who are staying back and the young people who are leaving. Some of them leave for a few months, some leave for a few years with the intention of returning, some leave forever because they have a better deal elsewhere. And so it is mainly the elderly. And a lot of people, some of the elderly people told me that they had gone to Kolkata to work for a few months to make money to repair their houses, and came back. So this is the kind of migratory pattern that I see. And it also depends on how much land you have back home, right? So you go for a few months to make enough money to build your house in brick. And then you realize that you need another floor. So you go back and start to work. And then you realize that actually you don't want to stay there because there are practically no opportunities. So, you try and make a better life elsewhere. So this is, and this is where I've been talking to people who had to return to the Sundarban for uh, the recent SEER censuses, because they want to be able to vote, but uh, they are working in Chennai. It costs a lot of money to go back. They don't necessarily have the papers because those have been destroyed in a cyclone or eaten up by mice. It's really a difficult cycle for them, to try and meet the state's expectations of what it means to be a citizen. It's not as if the state has done much for them. So, but they still hope, and want the state to be accountable. So this is quite, um, yeah, it's resilience.
Yeah. When we started the conversation, you spoke about how when you first went into the Sundarbans, people there told you that it's impossible to write about them unless you write about the tiger or know about the tiger. It's also impossible to talk about the Sundarbans without talking about the tiger. And the other thing about your work is the legend of Bon Bibi. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about both, how the local communities look at the tiger and what Bon Bibi is?
So when they told me that I needed to understand their tiger before being able to write about them, the legend of Bon Bibi came into, the picture, and it's a very beautiful story where a young woman who had been abandoned by her mother at birth, had been raised by a deer in a forest, and had received uh, the voice of Allah telling him that she needed to go to the land of the 18 tides. Before that, she decides to go to Mecca and Medina to get Fatima's blessing and some holy earth. And then she returns, and then she goes to the land of the 18 tides. She is accompanied by her brother who doesn't want to be left behind, who finds her because, anyway, that's another story. So the brother and her go to the land of the 18 tides, and they realize that there is this man eating tiger. And this is what Allah had told her, that she needed to do something because, out of compassion, he was feeling terrible that this shape shifting Brahmin tiger was killing people. So she tells Dokhin Rai to stay in the southern parts of the island and to leave the northern islands for the people. But Dokhin Rai's greed gets the upper hand, and one day he decides to kill this young boy called Dukhe. Dukhe, realizes what is going to happen and calls out to Ma Bon Bibi. She comes and saves him. And then the tiger gets contrite. He comes to see her with his friend. There's a Pir Baragazi Kha, who tells her that she's actually a divine being. So Dokhin Rai, with his friend the Pir, come to see Pono Bibi, and then Dokhin Rai asks forgiveness and calls her mother. And then she says, I've adopted this little boy as my son. If you are also going to be my son, you two are brothers. And from now on, you two are brothers. So you have responsibility towards each other. You need to look out for each other. You need to make sure that nobody goes hungry. So you cannot enter the forest if your hands are not empty and your heart is not pure. And very often, when people were killed by tigers, and even as recently as just 4 years back, somebody I knew, a friend of mine called Orjun, was killed by a tiger. And people kept telling me, why did he need to go to the forest? He had an NGO job, he had a salary. And his wife told me, well, our daughter was getting married and he wanted, some wood. So he went there with the others. So what for me is, it's the story of coexistence. It's the story of learning to share. The tiger needs to share his wood and, the rest of the forest products like honey and crabs and fish. And people need to be subservient in a way to the tiger, and recognize that, you know, that's his forest and they cannot take if they already have a job or if they have a piece of land or if they otherwise have a way of, an income or a source that, would allow them to live without needing to go to the forest. And so this is something that is very, very ingrained in people, that we do not go to the forest if we don't need to. It has to be a last desperate act. And it is only when it is a last desperate act that we are, in a way, protected by Ma Bonavidi. If you do it out of greed, then chances are you will get killed because the tiger can recognize that. So, and a lot of people believe that. I knew a poacher who, this was 25 years ago, and I was very new, and I told him, you must have a big Bon Bibi shrine, because you depend on the forest so much. And he said, are you crazy? Bon Bibi is no good for me. I need Makali, you know. Makali is good for poachers, taxi drivers, policemen, people with violent jobs. I am a poacher. How can she be helpful to me? She's only good for the little guys. And so this is where I learned more and realized that this whole story about Bon Bibi was a story again of coexistence and sharing, and the fact that she's sent by Allah. So a lot of Muslim communities that I interviewed about Bon Bibi told me that they did not worship her, but they venerated her the way they would a Sufi saint or their parents, and they made a distinction between the two. And the Muslim shrines that I saw had flowers and batasha. It's a little piece of sweet that were left on these earthen mounds that represented Bono Bibi. So there was no figure, there were these earthen mounds. So it is really for me, a story of coexistence. You live in this space that is so dangerous, that is so violent. What do you go around doing it? Well, you learn to share and you learn to look out for each other.
Right. Which kind of brings me to the last segment. You've often called for a reworlding of the Anthropocene through the Asian lens. In your view, how does that kind of differ from the standard narrative that we hear in the West? And I mean, the story about Pond Bibi kind of lays the foundation for this question as well.
Exactly. It is, through stories like Bon Bibi that you find all across Asia that sort of remind you that there is perhaps a new. This is what Prasenjit Dwara in The Crisis of Global Modernity, he was arguing that there is perhaps an Asian way to, you know, uh, makes allow us to perhaps face the Anthropocene. I don't completely agree because for me, places like China, exterminated its wildlife 1,000 years ago. But you do have so perhaps not certain countries within Asia, but on the whole in Asia, which holds nearly two-thirds of the world's population, you have to coexist. You have to, live together. So the European nations go on and on about global warming, and they are the ones who caused it, really. The other, they talk about migration and immigration coming into their country. Hell, the country that has the most migrants today is Bangladesh, with the Rohingyas, more than 1 million. Germany or France or no other country has as many migrants, you know, coming together. So we need to remember that, Asia is where everything is happening. Asia is where, global warming and its effects is already perceptible in a big way. People are moving, people are thinking about these things. Also, it's a place that for me is a lot more, it has a lot more vitality than anywhere else. There's no place for cynicism. You have to act, you have to do it quickly, you have to coexist. We are brought up, living amidst people who speak different languages, who practice different cuisines. So I feel that in Asia, people are a lot more open to perhaps share. There's less this idea of the individual, right? It is more about the community. However, this said, in India, we really first need to think about how do we organize communities around this if caste divides us, if religion keeps dividing us. But the only solution forward really is to basically really have this philosophy of coexistence. And it's a give and take. It is a world where we have to live with the crows and the monkeys and the rats and everything else. Yeah.
That's
So,
it's a very interesting way of looking at it. Yes, of course.
yeah.
Yeah. Just one final question. Given all that we have learned about the Sundarbans today in this conversation, if there was one kind of research question that you would want to address about climate policy in the Sundarbans in the next 10 years, maybe, what would it be?
So, I've been wanting to start book boats in the Sundarban. Boats which would be full of books and which would go from one island to another or would circle the island and stop at different places. It could be manned by students from Jadavpur University, from Presidency College in Kolkata, from students from elsewhere in India. There could be language classes, there could be reading classes, there could be, classes on how to write a CV, how to uh, use a computer. For me, really, education is the most important thing. And this is where I feel China got it right. It spent so much more money than India on primary education. And we cannot really do anything without having a literate population. So I would spend a lot more time educating people and uh, you know, teaching them philosophy, teaching them literature, teaching them. And so this is how conservation literature could be taught, through these ways. And so having these kind of floating libraries that, you know, flow through the Sundarban would allow people to think of their own policies, to think of what they need most, to know enough to be able to ask the government to organize things in a certain way or organize it themselves, And I feel that you can't do that if you do not have a literate population. And unfortunately, those who get an education in the Sundarban, the first thing they do is they leave. So it is always those who haven't been able to get an education who are left behind. And so this is, I would say, for the entirety of India, really, it would be, just educate everyone. So that's the policy that I would start with. And for that, you need school teachers who are going to be there.
Yeah, yeah, right. Thank you so much for this conversation. I know this was really interesting and it kind of transported us to a world that, many of us won't really go to, won't ever know of. Thank you for making us a little more aware about it. Yeah,
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
of course.